Here is start with Gareth, again from the city, talking about the situation that the city is in from a resilience point of view. Then we're going to go to Ilse, who's going to talk about it from a tourism perspective, again on behalf of the city. Just come forward a bit, you're perilously close to the edge of that platform. You're making me nervous. So Ilse will come next. Then we're going to go to Simon, if he doesn't fall off the side of the stage there. And then to Leanne back, and then finally back to Hermione. But Hermione won't have much to say because she's had quite a good say already. And then we're going to come to the floor for questions. So can I, Gareth, ask you to go first and lay out how you see, we need to get your PowerPoint's just coming up, I think, Gareth.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Harold, for inviting me. I really enjoyed your presentation, Hermione, and the first one was very thought-provoking and really amazing to see how the concept of resilience is gaining traction across a number of different systems in society. I am the Director of Resilience in the City of Cape Town. It's a unit that was formed during the Day Zero drought and has been very, very busy since that period because, of course, the intersection of Day Zero then with COVID and even now working furiously on what it means for food, fuel and food and fuel availability in the context of a war in Ukraine at the moment. What we define resilience as, and it's a contested term, I admit, is the ability of people, communities, systems and businesses to survive, adapt and thrive no matter what shocks or stresses are experienced in a particular locale. And so, on the extreme, it's about survival, but on the opportunity side, it is about adaptation and ultimately thriving. So it would be hard not to talk and mention resilience for visitors to Cape Town without mentioning the very extreme drought event that Cape Town lived through. And that was, I think, an important lesson for the city government that while it has its own role in building resilience on behalf of the city, one part of a system cannot do it all. And so that was an extreme event, and that resulted in the city having to cut back water by 50%, which was done by ordinary people and ordinary households. And for that, I think Cape Town is certainly very, very grateful. But out of that, obviously, come a number of learnings. And so when we think of a place like Cape Town, we think of a couple of shock events that are most plausible, and that includes drought. So what were some of those particular learnings? One was that actually we did need to invest in faster in a great amount of water augmentation. So over the course between now and 2030, there will be an additional 300 megalitres of water a day brought into the system across aquifer abstraction and manager aquifer recharge, across water reuse. The city is planning to build the largest water reuse plant in the world, as well as a small permanent desal plant to augment the existing dam system. What does that mean for resilience? It means that from our modeling point of view, we would not want to be in a position where we would have to curtail water to the extent that we had to do before on an occasion anything less than 1 in 200 years. So in that regard, the vision is water resilient in the full sense of the word by 2030. But thankfully, those lessons have also been learnt. And if we were to intersect a very severe drought in the period up until there, our ability to manage pressure, the learnings of ordinary households and businesses, the co-investment by businesses and households into alternative water already makes the system particularly more resilient. What's interesting to think about when one thinks of that example is that Cape Town went through that, and of course there's been a lot of activity and action. It's much harder often in society to get us to start preparing for events that are plausible but for which have not happened. So we look at it from a risk point of view. We might attach probabilities to it, but it's hard. I mean, none of us were prepared, certainly in a wide societal sense, for COVID. And granted, adjustments were made very, very quickly, and we're still sort of growing out and living in the context of hopefully its tail. But there are other shock events for which we, as a system, need to prepare for. So other work that we're trying to proactively put work into now is particularly around water quality and the state of our sewage infrastructure in Cape Town. So significantly new advanced investments going into that space. But we're also having to think more deeply about what it means to intersect with heat waves in Cape Town, what it means to have an increased number of coastal surges, which is important. We have a 307-kilometer coastline in the city alone, and parts of it are particularly vulnerable. But important as well, I think, from an economic perspective, is of course our ability to be energy secure or energy resilient. And that is a difficult thing in the context of a city which buys 96-7% of its electricity from a external parastatal, that being Eskom, with all of its own problems. And so we're currently on the early stages of trying to break that model and be able to build a greater degree of energy security. So notwithstanding what may be happening in broader South African society, that we have a greater ability to be able to withstand load shedding. And so in the last 3 weeks or so, a significant independent power procurement bid was put out for relatively small scale, not that small, but relatively small scale private bidders to co-invest into the energy network to start building that resilience. And that will be grown out over the course of the next 3 to 4 years, with much larger investments into renewable energy in order to secure the grid to a greater extent. One cannot get entirely resilient from Eskom, but one can get more resilient, and so that is important. In conclusion, in terms of concluding my opening remarks, what's important for us as a metropolitan government is to ensure that, of course, we ourselves are a going concern and are resilient. The very core of our mandate is the ability to ability to deliver basic services, water, electricity, solid waste management and transport, and related services. And those services are vitally important to create the enabling environment, of course, for investment and for semigration and to attract visitors to our city. So we, of course, have to make sure that that model is able to sustain itself in the context of a sort of fairly tepid growing national economy. We put a lot of work, of course, into that. It's a bit of a chicken and egg. Of course, more investment brings in more income, but at the same time, we have to ensure that we invest significantly in order to guarantee a growth in revenue so that we can reproduce our basic services. So financial resilience is important. So in terms of the three things I mentioned, water, energy, and financial resilience are all important. But I can't get away from the fact as well that we're all responsible for building resilience from where we sit. And key to that, of course, is making sure that when things get particularly tough, we're able to come together and able to solve those problems in a concerted and coherent fashion. Thank you very much, Harold.
Gareth, if I could just say, I'd like to think there is somebody doing similar work in London. I fear there probably isn't. But thank you very much for that. You quite cheered me up. Ilse, we found your presentation. I'm relieved to hear. So do you want to take us through the economic development and tourism side of the work? I assume you work quite closely with Gareth.
I know him.
Have you met him before?
I know him. He works with my green economy with Helen and some of my other colleagues. Yeah.
So one of the impressive things about Cape Town is the way in which the government is actually quite joined up at the city level. It's not true everywhere, unfortunately. Yeah. Ilse, you have the floor.
Thanks, Harold. Hi, everybody. My name is Ilse van Skalkwyk. So I'm from provincial government. So I work for the Western Cape Department of Economic Development and Tourism. And I'm the Chief Director responsible for sector support. So when I'm sitting here, we're sitting in front of each other, I'm coming to you from experiences in terms of the last, well, particularly with COVID, but across different sectors. So I look after manufacturing, tourism, agri-processing, oil and gas, the services side, so everything else they deem as a priority. But in terms of the word resilience, and I did something similar with Productivity SA a number of months ago, it's very much to just link onto the previous presentation, we came out of in 2019, and in tourism we're now seeing that as a benchmark, but from a South African and a Western Cape perspective, it wasn't a great benchmark because we were coming out of a day zero and the harm that did in terms of our brand, and already we weren't performing at our peak. And now we're using 2019 figures as a baseline, which sort of scares me. And I was just busy finalizing our tourism strategy for the next 10 years, which was a growth strategy in terms of looking at what do we need to do. And then suddenly I had to pause and rewrite 2 chapters and add things on in terms of recovery and re-look at our growth period to say, we're only looking at a partial recovery in 2022 and in 2023 when we can really start seeing growth. But it's so pleasing to be at a show like today and just to see the positive energy. And so the hashtag shifts happen in terms of things that's happened globally and that continue to happen, and how do we prepare from it. And I've been speaking to a lot of businesses to say, what's happened, where are you, your normal things that we look at in terms of tourism, like what's your occupancy rate, how many flights, we monitor this literally every week, how many flights are coming in and out of Cape Town, what does recovery look like? But in terms of resilience, we also have to have a little bit of a pause to say, what are the factors that's actually sticking? What are the things that, and I'm going to look at it from an overall business perspective, that's actually still with us and that we're continuing to see. Somebody mentioned to me earlier to say, are you still showering with a bucket? Has that changes happened, or have we just sort of slowly, like with masks, they're disappearing, and what's sort of staying? So what lessons have we learned? And if we look globally, we're seeing big changes from, I've looked at certain trends from the year 2000 onwards in terms of the number of Fortune 500 companies that have closed. Disruption that's happened not just in terms of a pandemic and a disease, but we've been seeing shifts in terms of different risk factors continue to happen. The number of natural disasters that's happening globally. Climate change is almost becoming, it's the norm, it's there, we're dealing with it, but there's the impact of that is that we are becoming much more resilient in terms of just dealing with different crises globally. Cyber breaches, and the risks isn't just natural. I think that's quite important, that the businesses, how are you adapting to other risks, like technology risks? Things that we're seeing in our own organizations, like cyber attacks, people looking at in terms of different types of disruptions, and how are businesses dealing with that. So the question is, as a destination, as a company, as an entrepreneur, what do you do in terms of that? How are you adapting? Are you learning from it? Do you have a proper strategy in terms of saying, I'm changing these things in my own business, versus, oh, it's happening to me? And that's really the difference. So different industry shifts and gaps that we've seen in terms of advanced electronics, airlines, banking, pharmaceuticals, telecommunications. A big thing that's happening in terms of, we spoke about it earlier this morning, from carbon trading and what's going to happen in terms of South Africa being a long-haul destination and how are we adapting in our business. Other things in terms of just with regards to pharmaceuticals and the role they're playing in terms of the future, advanced electronics, gaps we've seen in terms of their business models, different software change, etc. That technological changes is happening at a rapid speed. And what COVID has done is it's pushed it 20 years in the future. It's made people being more adaptive or being forced to adapt. If you think about people working from home, how long would you, and how many company policies would you have had to write to get people to be able to do that? I always use the example of Skype and saying it was always there, people did use it, but now look how easily we've adapted in terms of online meetings. So just quickly, and I'm sure the presentation is going to be shared because I've built it into like a toolkit type of thing. 6 true aspects you've got to look at in terms of dimensions of resilience: financials, operations, technology, organization, reputation, and your business model. What do we mean in terms of that? So financial resilience, institutions must balance short and longer term financial aims. So don't take too much risks, but look after that in terms of financial resilience. A lot of companies have wiped out their cash flow. They don't have that runway anymore post-COVID. And this is just an example in terms of what different companies have done in terms of income streams. And that's my key take on terms of that, is in terms of looking in your business, what other income streams can you attract? How are you diversifying? If you are not actively pursuing that, you will be in trouble, because that's what COVID shown us, where people were relying on too much inbound tourism. They weren't focusing on domestic, and that left them at risk. Number 2, operational resilience. Resilient organizations maintain robust production capacity that can both flex to meet challenges and demand. So this one was interesting for me in terms of saying, looking at your own production line or whatever service you're selling or experience, etc. So example that I can give you in the Western Cape was when we went into the state of lockdown, and companies, wine industries who we work with, were no longer able to sell wine. They couldn't transport wine. It was unlawful in our country. And a lot of them, like Distel, I worked with companies, De Moulin, they literally said to me, if we didn't start manufacturing sanitizers, our businesses would have closed. So they utilized the same production capacity, they utilized the same expertise, but they were able to pivot their business in terms of looking at a different income stream. So this sort of touches on both. So you've got to think about your organization's capacity and what else can I do with the same skills and the capacity that I have. Then in terms of number 3, technological resilience, very key in terms of everything we do. So how have we used technology to adapt? Big things we've seen in terms of the shifts in terms of consumer behavior. If you can just think of online shopping and retail, and it's exactly the same with tourism. How has communicating with, and the sales funnel stays the same, but how has technology enabled you to shift your consumer trends in terms of where people are actually making that purchase? So a big example is in South Africa is our Checker 60 in terms of the number of people that are now just comfortable with online shopping and no longer doing it in store. Other things which we've seen adaptation to is in terms of the banking apps and your financial services side, etc. So again, if you're not actively planning for this to be incorporated in your business, no matter if you're selling a good or a service, you will be left behind. Number 4 is organizational resilience, and I don't want to have too much time on this, but very much in terms of how are you supporting and diversifying your workforce. Gosh, we've seen a lot of challenges in relation to this in the tourism industry. We're currently in a massive skills shortage where businesses have had to let go of staff. And a lot of the good staff have found other employment, and they are sitting it's across the value chain. They cannot seem to find staff. I'm getting complaints from airlines, from accommodation, from restaurants, across the value chain, where businesses are unable to meet the demand because of the rapid recovery we're in currently, which is not a bad problem, but it's going to create a constraint because your service is going to start being affected. So upskilling your staff, supporting your staff, creating different opportunities. We heard yesterday about in Bloemfontein how they've dealt with at a hotel in terms of an equity of a different ownership model. So again, looking after the organization from a staffing perspective is key. Number 5 is reputation resilience. It's beyond a logo. I wish the logoitis, as I call it, people would think beyond that. The reputation from an environmental, social, ecological perspective is critical in terms of your brand. So people are, the buyer is looking at differently. They are the reputation, and I always talk about the voice of the consumer is stronger than ever. People believe other people. They are very seldom trying to believe what's on a poster. So brand reviews, YouTube reviews, TripAdvisor, and it extends to any product and service is becoming more powerful. So the way in which you protect your reputation is becoming more critical than ever. Those are just some examples. And then business model resilience. Again, this links to the aspect about the income streams, but being in this competitive landscape, what are you doing and what are you shifting in terms of your business model? So new risks and opportunities in the consumer industry is what we've highlighted there, but you've had to have identified that up front. When else have you looked at your business plans? And then, yeah, that's just some of the checklists. There's a very nice little link I found where there's a toolkit where you can run it as a management team in your company. Just check your scoring in terms of how resilient you are. And then this was just to show a good example of how in the Western Cape we've had to become resilient and dealing with COVID, pivoting your staff, going paperless, looking at how we're supporting businesses, people being able to access vaccines from anywhere. It was an example I've had to live through in terms of not just adapting every year. We literally changed week to week. We had to change our game plan in terms of how do we support businesses and what's effective. So what your example about FinFinder, that was in our business support model. That was literally one of our things we did in like a weekend, put up a website, started putting tools on there. How do we support businesses that suddenly have to operate differently? So that's me. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much indeed, Ilse. I think what's very much come out of this panel so far is that it isn't just about climate change. That may be the biggest, but it's certainly not the only. And I'm a little tired now, as I guess you are, of people saying, you know, water shortages are going to be a once-in-a-thousand-year event, which I still hear back in England. Simply not true. These things are going to come thick and fast, unfortunately. If we could go next to you, Leanne, to give us your perspective.
Not yet. Is it working yet? Okay, thank you. So just from my perspective, I think it sort of leads in quite nicely to what Ilse was talking about, is that within BDO, we, as the crisis hit, as the pandemic hit, we had a lot of clients coming to us and saying, what do I do? Where do I go to? Where do we go from here? And we sort of had a look at, first we helped them to react in terms of what are we going to do immediately, but then we had to realize that our clients needed to develop resilience and build their skills around resilience. And a lot of them turned around to us and said, but how do I do that? I understand that I've got to build resilience throughout my organization, but how do I do it? And so we had a look in terms of what are the key skills that are needed. And they actually fall into 3 areas that are needed in order to have resilience. And the first one is around trust. The second area is around information, data. And the third area is around systems and processes. So each of those are actually, if you need to build on each of those to actually develop your resilience and to become strong so that you can become sustainable in the long term. And bearing in mind that the pandemic situation that we dealt with, the water crisis we dealt with before, and as Harold was mentioning, we're going to be facing more and more of these crises as the years go on. These black swan type of events where we've called them black swans before. I don't think they're black swans. We're living in a VUCA world, and this is the way the world is going to be. And it's important that organizations don't become the next Nokia, the next Kodak type of organization. You need to be able to be resilient, and it comes down to leadership, and it comes down to the people who drive in those organizations. So when we talk about trust, for example, it's actually about developing partnerships, and it's linked to that knowledge component, but it's about having relationships and having trusting relationships. So whether it's a trusting relationship with your funder, whether it's a trusting relationship with your staff, with your suppliers, and it's about not putting your head in the sand. It's about working with your ecosystem. I think we've heard it a couple of times on various panels today about the ecosystem that we work in, and we're not individuals. We are all, what benefits me benefits you, and we're all in this together. It's about sharing information. And in addition, it's relating to the information component. So having data and having information, being aware of what's going on in your market or your markets, being aware, don't have your head in the sand. You've got to be not only aware of what's going on, but you've also got to try and be one step ahead. I'm trying to forecast what is actually going to happen in your markets. And when it comes to that, I'm urging all of you that are in the tourism sector at the moment, yes, things are starting to look up, things are starting to look better, but don't assume we're going back to the way we were before. This is a new world we're going to be living in. It's a new world we're going to be operating in. And that means in order for all of you to be resilient, you need to understand that world and what it could potentially hold for us. And so I'm cautioning you just to consider your markets and consider the trends that are influencing your markets as well. And have you taken time to adapt your products? Are you agile enough to actually adapt going forward so that you can actually meet the needs of your market going forward? And do you have the processes in place that you can change quickly? Do you have the systems in place that you can change quickly? So you need to build change into your lives, into your employees' lives, into the business lives, and make that the only constant that you're going to get is actually going to be change. And for those of you that are interested, I've actually run some scenarios in what we think the tourism industry is going to look like in terms of what the recovery is going to look like in South Africa in terms of when are we going to bounce back? Are we going to bounce back? And we've run it on 6 different scenarios, brought it down to 3 because there's some similarities in all of them. But in reality, by looking at the various markets, and I'm looking at the inbound market only in particular, I'm not looking at the domestic market, it is going to take a while for us to get back, if you want to call it, to the sort of numbers that we experienced. But the markets are not going to be the same. So we are going to have increases in certain markets, but we are going to see decreases in certain markets too, or we're not going to see the rebound happening to the same extent. So we need to be cautious of where you're operating and what markets you're actually operating in, and be conscious of that. And I mean, to me, and I applaud all of these businesses that are here now, that have been resilient and have been able to get this far. But don't think that the hurdle that we've got over the hurdle. We might be able to see a finish line over there, but there's lots of hurdles that are coming our way, and you need to be able to adapt quickly and handle those hurdles as they come towards you. So in terms of the opportunities, obviously, I think that the South African market in particular has responded, the tourism product owners has responded remarkably to the domestic market. And we can definitely say that this has been a hugely positive experience for the development of our domestic market. We've been wanting this market to develop for a long, long time. Nothing has been developing very, very slowly. But COVID has really made the market snowball, which has been absolutely fantastic. And my urge to you as product owners is don't give up on the domestic market going forward. And I always keep on saying to my clients is to flip how you view the market. Consider your domestic market as your bread and butter, and the inbound market is sort of like the cherry on the top, as opposed to the other way around. If you want to be resilient going forward, build your product on the domestic market to the best that you can. And I think from that perspective, I've got a few other things, but I think it's probably best to hand over to Simon, because it's in terms of his product.
Just make a couple of comments, Leanne, on what you've said. I mean, one of the things that's very striking from the British experience of the black swans, and it's one that doesn't, I think, perhaps impact on South Africa as much last time, but it may next, which is when that Chinese boat got stuck in the Suez Canal, a whole lot of jobs were lost because it was impossible to produce. And we've still got major problems over chips in the production of some vehicles and so on. So my car, which is quite old and very second-hand, is currently going up in value, which is the most extraordinary thing. Thank you very much. But the consequences for the economy as a whole are very grim indeed. And I think that whole tradition of just-in-time supply is something everybody needs to think about.
Yep.
But the other point I wanted to make is that South Africa is really lucky to have a domestic tourism market. There are big chunks of Africa where there is no domestic tourism market and won't be for a long time. And I think that is certainly something that South Africa should build on. If you're in the Gambia and you close the borders, there is no tourism, because the country is not big enough to have domestic tourism, and that's been true for many of the Caribbean islands as well. Simon, please.
Yeah, thanks, Harold. So I'm just a game ranger. So probably unlike my rather sort of erudite and learned colleagues here, I've come work at the coalface with guests. In 2007, my wife and I took a huge risk and borrowed a lot of money and bought a business, a lodge in the Drakensberg. And we do battlefield tours, and if you have an interest, and I'm sorry about this, Harold, but it's 3treehill.co.za. Go and have a look. It's a very nice lodge. But we've been talking about Black Swan events, and the so-called Black Swan events. I just want to take you guys through a few things that have happened. .com crisis, subprime crisis, various pandemics that we've had, from Ebola through to SARS, through to what we're experiencing now. Conflicts, the latest one, of course, being the Ukraine. You know, the July riots that we had in Natal, and there's floods there now. I think the point I'm trying to make is these so-called Black Swan events are going to keep happening. And how do we build resilience against them? Because something else is coming. It may be a volcano, it might be another virus, you know, so how do we do that? And I think one of the things we should consider very strongly is, rather than collaborating and cooperating in the face of a crisis, let's do it beforehand. So, of course, there's the old adage of necessity being the father of invention. And during this COVID crisis, when we were sitting at home and twiddling our thumbs and watching our savings disappear, we have a lot of ideas running around in our heads. And of course, the connected mind sees the most opportunities. And with that, it makes the most sense to be speaking to people in the industry and to collaborate with them. And I'll get onto that just now. There's a lot of things that you can do at a large level to make yourself more resilient than you were before. And I think Chris from the Vineyard spoke about a whole lot of things: grey water usage, watching your own water usage, generating your own power, being careful about your waste, maintaining your own infrastructure in terms of just pure accessibility, building your local network of supply, looking after your local market, and we spoke about that just now, Harold Martz. You know, looking after our domestic market, which is what has kept us going through this last crisis that we've been through. And I think just in terms of sustainable tourism, there's a couple of things you can divide it up into at a large level, and above that as well on the upstream side. But I think the most important part of sustainability is the economic sustainability. If you're not economically sustainable, everything else falls away. The conservation won't work. The socio-economic sustainability won't work. So I think that's probably the most important thing. And if you can work out ways to collaborate with people in the industry, one of the things that we came up with was a collaboration of lodges, where we decided that having our own reservation, sales and marketing team at each lodge doesn't make sense. So we lodge owners, we're good at looking after people. We're good at hosting, making sure they have nice food, the activities are wonderful, the game walks, get nice and close to a rhino, awesome battlefield tours, reduce people to tears. That is one of our objectives. But one of the things that we're not really good at is trying to get guests to us. So why not collaborate and work at how you're going to get more effectively guests to come to you? So that's one of the things that we did during the lockdown. And if you have an interest, you can go and have a look at the African Safari Collective .co.za is something that we set up in order to make ourselves more resilient, because we are going to a new future. I don't think we are going to, and I don't think we should want to go back to business as usual, because I believe that business as usual was taking us along, particularly economically, a path of unsustainability, with the way the value chains are developing, the access for local travelers to the mid and upmarket lodges in South Africa. So, without wanting to take up too much of your time, I just think there's a lot of things that we can do on a collaborative basis, and communicating with each other, I think, is the way forward. And thanks, Harold, for this opportunity.
Simon, I just wanted to say thank you for that. I just wanted to say, Simon, there's quite an interesting connection between what you're talking about with the collective that you've started, and you know I'm very excited by that, but also with what Hermione's doing. I think we should make sure there is a conversation between you and Hermione about what can be done at that micro destination level. Because you've been talking, Hermione, about Victoria Falls. Simon is talking about a group of lodges in KwaZulu-Natal and I think one in Mpumalanga. And I just think there's a real synergy there. It may or may not bear fruit, but it's certainly interesting. Hermione, do you want to say anything just as a reflection on what the others have said, and then we're going to come to the floor for questions?
Sure. Thanks, Harold. Really interesting spectrum of views. Yeah, such a pleasure to listen to you all. I think a couple of things have really struck out for me, and it's really the emphasis on not only focusing on climate and environment, and we had this conversation about resilience, and I really couldn't agree with you more, Simon, that if people aren't economically stable and confident and able to function, then there are no people to look at other forms of resilience. So I think that's absolutely key, and clearly financing has a role to play in that. One thing that I thought is interesting is that we've talked quite a lot about suppliers and supply chains and value chains, and there have been a number of reports, including one that the World Bank has done, with really interesting evidence about the results through this pandemic about which types of value chains have been most resilient or have survived. And every time in all of these reports, it's been the local value chains that have been most resilient. And I think I personally find that really heartwarming, because at the end of the day, what that says is that, global value chains might be more efficient and cheaper and all the rest of it, but actually people who know each other and meet each other and look each other in the eyes at the end of the day are the ones who are prepared to wait that little bit longer for a payment or do someone a favor here and there. And those have been the supply chains that have worked and kept people in business. And I find that really inspiring for the future of places and the destinations that we're talking about, but also businesses and operators too. I had a kind of question, Harold. Can I pose it?
You're entitled to ask questions, Hermione.
Okay. I wondered just from the rest of the panelists, if you could share perhaps some of the thinking around measuring resilience that you're all doing, like what some of the actual indicators are that you look at to try and demonstrate progress on impact. Thanks.
Gareth, you want to go first?
So I think this would probably be answered at a different scale, but I work extensively with indicators at a city level. So we have a city resilience index for Cape Town that has 120 quantitative indicators for the city, and 150 qualitative indicators for the city. So it's a methodology that I found from the consulting company called Arup. It was, I think, funded by the Rockefeller Foundation. And it takes, those indicators are built out of the extensive body of knowledge around resilience. So, at a city level, you would look at everything from community cohesion to safety, to jobs and the economy, to disaster readiness, to infrastructure, and those kinds of things. So that is, it's a measure which I'm obviously very happy to share with anyone. But the intention of us in Cape Town, so we did our first resilience measurement in the beginning of 2018, and we'll do our next measurement once the census results come out. So South Africa is currently going through a census at the moment, so a fair amount of our quantitative indicators would come out of that, so those results will be there, and we'd be able to determine the relative progression or regression against indicators in that regard. And just to make one more comment, learning from that particular process, which is done at a city level, I worked with a team to create a water resilience index for Cape Town as well, also based on, I think, about 80 or so quantitative indicators and equivalent amount of qualitative indicators. And what I found quite useful was not only is that useful to measure relative change over time, but I found it an excellent engagement tool with stakeholders that you want to bring together. Because quantitative indicators are useful to an extent, but getting 40, 50, and in some cases 100 people in a room who come from different parts of a system to say, what do we deem to be the resilience of this and that, was also very important. So I found it as an excellent conversation starter to be able to use these methods of building a resilience index for a system to get other people to think about where they fit into a system.
Elsewhere in Southern Africa that you want to just quickly share? No, that's what I feared. I think you may be fairly unique in having done this work, Gareth. Can we, Simon, one from you and then a couple from the floor, and then we're going to move to the next panel. Simon.
So just responding to Gareth, I just want to urge this benchmarking process to include some sort of participatory, socio-economic, whatever you want to call it, change that we need to see in tourism, definitely in South Africa, but probably throughout sub-Saharan Africa. You know, when you're talking to tourism value chain from the bottom all the way through, you're largely looking at a sea of white faces, and that's not sustainable. So that's, you know, I think there are things that government could be doing that they're not, and rather than forcing people with a stick to build a more inclusive economy, dangling a carrot is maybe there's a better way to do it.
Thank you for that. Is there anybody on the floor with a burning question? It's getting late in the day, isn't it?
There's one here.
Sorry. Where?
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity and great presentations from the panel. I just have a simple question, looking at resilience and especially in the context of climate change. Given that tourism is responsible for 25% of greenhouse gas emissions, and it's such a huge contributor to that, and this is like, as the World Economic Forum says, a pandemic in the making, climate change. How, from a financing perspective, say IFC, how are you looking at green funding that reimagines tourism and minimizes this? And from the sector perspective, say the government, what sort of strategies and policies are you formulating which speaks to a reimagined tourism, which appreciates or incentivizes deceleration in terms of climate change?
That's quite a tough question.
I'll take it.
Hermione.
It is a tough question. It's a good question. And I have a couple of thoughts. I expect others will as well. So from the financing perspective, we now have a green retrofitting product, which didn't exist before. So that's something that's just come up in the last 18 months in response to demand. And that is a big push for IFC. So instead of creating greenfield, we're now looking at a debt facility basically for retrofitting and greening of existing hotel infrastructure. I think from the policy and the destination perspective, there's a lot to do. And one of the things that I've certainly noticed in the destinations that I'm working in Africa is a lot more segmentation in the market. So destination managers and governments and other people starting to really kind of target more precisely the types of tourists that they want. And in most cases, that's been tourists who are going to stay for longer. So maybe instead of taking 2 trips in a year, they're going to take 1 trip in a year, but spread it over longer time. and also diversing to much more local markets. So you talked a lot about domestic tourism a bit this morning, but then, you know, beyond that also kind of regional. So how do you attract people who are closer by and don't need to travel so far, perhaps on a more regular basis, to make up some of those numbers? And then, of course, there's a lot of, you know, focus now on, in terms of product development, on green and sustainable product building. So some thoughts.
I'd just like to answer your question as well. If I wasn't here right now, I'd be in Tenerife. Because in Tenerife, the Sea Fuel project has just managed to start fueling hire cars on Tenerife with hydrogen, which they're making just with sunshine from seawater. And that is a big part of the future, hydrogen power. I believe that Airbus by 2035 will have jets in the air flying on hydrogen. And that will make an enormous difference. EasyJet are now only buying aircraft that can be converted to fly on hydrogen. It's coming, it's not here yet. But if we don't get to hydrogen-powered aircraft, a lot of places in the world are going to be in a serious mess for tourism. South Africa won't be so badly hit by that, but if you're a Caribbean island, it will be a disaster. And I'm very hopeful of the hydrogen economy being a big part of the solution for both road transportation and aviation, and we need to encourage it. Can we thank the panel? It's been a really brilliant session so late in the day. But Leanne, Ilse, I'm tired, Hermione, Gareth, and Simon, thank you very much indeed. Thanks for that.